Our speaker tonight is Colin Calloway, who is Professor of History, and Samson Occam, Professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. And Dr. Calloway did his undergraduate work and his graduate work at the University of Leeds, England, where he received his PhD. And he has also taught at the College of Ripon and York St. John in England, Springfield High School in Vermont, and the Newberry Library in Chicago. He's the author of a number of books on Native American history and Native American history and studies, including the American Revolution in Indian Country, One Vast Winter Count, the Native American West before Lewis and Clark, which won 6 Best Book Awards, Crown and Calumet, the British Indian relations between 1783 and 1815. He's also edited a number of collections of essays and documents, including Reinterpreting New England Indians and the Colonial Experience, Our Hearts Fell to the Ground, Plains Indians, Views of How the West Was Won. His current project involves investigating the Highland Scots and the American Indians from a comparison point of view with how each of these groups dealt with colonialism and with each other. And the title of his lecture tonight is American Indians and the French and English War. Please welcome Colin Calloway.
Thank you, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here, of course. And I guess my assignment tonight is to maybe turn the focus half a turn on our view of the French and Indian War and offer it from a slightly different perspective, from the perspective of Native America. I may be the last person on earth qualified to do that, of course, because not only am I not Native American, I'm not any kind of an American, really. And although I work every day with Native colleagues and Native students, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have any special cultural insights to share on this. I do think, though, that hopefully I can share some common sense perspectives and we can gain a lot of understanding about an event like this simply by repositioning ourselves mentally, if not geographically. Simply by looking at the events that we're very familiar with, watching them unfold from a different position, maybe from the Ohio Valley rather than from Boston, maybe from Cherokee country instead of from Quebec, because the people in those places at that time, of course, were Native Americans, and their perspectives, I think, and their experiences and their motivations and their behavior is perhaps and was perhaps not as mysterious as we might think if we simply attribute to them normal human qualities and assume that probably they took the course of action that made the most sense to them in those circumstances and they acted out of their own self-interest. Excuse me while I get my crib notes here. And so for the title of this talk, I've taken the idea of the French and Indian War, which right there is heavily loaded. That's clearly not a title, I suppose, that the French used or that the Indians used, and called it instead the French and English War, because that is surely what it was for Indian peoples. And I think it allows us then to take Indian people out of that equation, set them aside a little bit, and perhaps look at the events as they unfolded and as they seem to appear in Indian country. So what I want to do tonight is not talk about the participation of Indian people, Indian warriors, in the various conflicts during the war in particular, but rather to think about how they understood the war, what it meant for them, and also what their experiences were during this conflict. I think sometimes that we assume that Indian peoples act as Indian people, all as one. There's a kind of Last of the Mohicans idea at work where Indians sort of come out of the forest, create mayhem, and then go home. And we're not really quite sure what they're doing, but we all know that Indians do that, so that's them fulfilling their assigned roles. And I think rather than thinking of Native American people or Indian people as a block who all act at once, it's helpful to break down our understandings of the sort of human landscape that's involved in this conflict. So yes, we have the French and we have the English, but who are the Indians? And where are the Indians? And how are they acting? And the key to doing that, I think, is to think beyond the term Indian or Native American as a collective descriptor, and think in terms of particular Indian nations or tribes or even communities who see themselves not, I think, necessarily simply on the western edge of an advancing frontier, but rather that see themselves in the center of their own universe. And that is a universe inhabited by all kinds of different people, which includes English people of various different colonies, French people, and dozens of different Indian nations and communities. So that each Indian nation sort of sits at the hub of a wheel, if you like, with spokes reaching out to other Indian nations, to European capitals, to colonial capitals, to colonial emissaries and traders. And what each Indian nation is effectively doing, although we rarely use that term when talking about Indians, is conducting its own foreign policy, or series of foreign policies dealing with a variety of different peoples. And as with anybody else's foreign policies, the dynamics are likely to change over time. When we look at Indian history, of course, we're constrained and limited in that most of what we read about Indian people is written by non-Indian people. So in the period of the 7 Years' War, most of what is written about Indian people is written by the British and the French, who are looking at what's happening in Indian country insofar as we can see it, and much of it they couldn't see because it was happening under their radar, and describing it in their terms. And so a favorite term that you get used by certainly the Brits, and I'm sure by the French too in their own phraseology, was that Indians are fickle. Boy, you can't trust these guys. One minute they'll be fighting with the French, then they're fighting against the French. One minute they're trading with the English, the next they seem to be betraying the English. They are described as being like corn in the wind, straw in the wind. There's no telling what they're going to do. Well, of course, if you're English or if you're French, that's an interpretation or an explanation that makes sense. It explains Indian behavior, which otherwise is inexplicable to you. What's wrong with these people? If they had any sense, they would be loyal to King George from A to Z. Obviously, it doesn't work like that in Indian country. Indian peoples and Indian communities find themselves in a very turbulent and violent world, and what they're doing is operating out of their own self-interest. So to answer the question, whose side were the Indians on in the 7 Years' War, the answer is quite simple. They were on the Indians' side. But the answer to that breaks down because you have to say, well, it was actually the Senecas were on the Senecas' side, the Mohawks are on the Mohawk side, the Delawares are on the Delaware side, and the Shawnees are on the Shawnee side, or at least for a time. Everything could change. And when that war happens, it is, if you've been coming to these talks, not just a colonial war, it's a world war. Winston Churchill calls it the First World War, and I think he's right. It's huge, it's enormous, it's a war the like of which has never been fought before, and it's conducted on the oceans, on several continents, and crucially in North America, which means that this world war that's being fought around the globe is also being fought in Indian country, in the Indians' backyards, as it were. And so we need to think about what is the impact of the war on the Indians' home front. Again, a term that we might apply to our own society or to Britain during the Second World War, but we're not accustomed to using that term to thinking of Indians, that Indians had a home front, which of course they did. When the warriors are away fighting, what's going on at home with the women and children, who's getting the crops in, and who's defending them if their villages are attacked during that time. And I think if we take those perspectives, it sets us up much more readily to get a better understanding and a better interpretation of what this war means for Indian peoples. And it also means something else, I think, in the way it ends. And I'll finish talking about that, I think. When the war breaks out, some Indian peoples lean heavily to the French. During the 17th century, the French had established a good network of relationships with Indian peoples around the Great Lakes. And they did that not because the French had some kind of special affinity for Indians. Sometimes you read historians and you'd get that impression that the Indians and French got along because, I don't know, French like to sit around campfire drinking wine and singing or something. That's not how it works. It works. The French make good relations and good alliances with Indians because they have to do. The French lack the population, they lack the resources that their English rivals to the south have. They are attempting to build an empire in North America and Canada, primarily on the fur trade. They need Indians as customers. You can't have a fur trade without Indians. And they also need Indians as allies against other Indian nations and against the English colonies to the south. So the French go out of their way, they bend over backwards to create and sustain alliances with Indian peoples, Indian nations, which are incredibly complex and incredibly precarious and require a lot of effort. When the war occurs, those peoples, with those long-standing relations with the French, gravitate to the French standard. Elsewhere, it's not such an open and shut case. In upstate New York, in eastern upstate New York, in Mohawk country, the Mohawks gravitate to the English because they have long-standing relations with Sir William Johnson and with the British Indian Department in that area. In the Ohio Valley, Shawnees and Delawares and people who have kind of come back to that area after a period of tremendous population dislocation are really caught. When General Braddock sets out to march towards Fort Duquesne on the expedition that results in his defeat and the destruction of his army, one of the Delaware leaders who is accompanying him at that point asks him for basically reassurances that when the war is over, when the Brits have won the war, that Indian land, the Indians' lands, the Indians' homelands, that is, will be preserved inviolate, left intact. And Braddock says to him something like, "No savage shall inherit the land." Basically, when this war is over, when we win this war, this is going to be British land. Don't have any ideas that this is going to be left in Indian hands. Well, Shingas was not the kind of guy to tell that to, and so Shingas basically turned and went, and he took his warriors with him. And Braddock marched to disaster. What happened to General Braddock on the Monongahela would not have happened had he had Indian scouts with him and Indian allies and Indian support with him. His disaster reinforced among those Indians they'd made the right choice. The British seemed incapable of waging effective forest warfare. It seemed like their best bet was to side with the power that seemed most likely to win. That was the French at that point. And the French and Indians won some impressive early victories. But as you know, the tide of the war turned. William Pitt takes over as effectively as Prime Minister in Britain, conducts the war with renewed energy and vigor, and has quite a simple strategy: to strip France of its colonies. And you could do that by emphasizing British naval sea power, paying subsidies to German allies in Europe to keep Austrian and French armies bogged down in bloodbaths, and concentrate military effort in North America. And because of the global nature of the war, the British are able to pick apart that French-Indian alliance, not directly in North America, but on the oceans. By defeating the French at sea, by destroying the French Atlantic fleet, for instance, in Quiberon Bay, The British cut off French forces in North America, and they effectively sever supply routes. The French-Indian alliance depends upon regular sources of supply, because an Indian alliance, and we'll return to this in a few minutes, depends upon having gifts, having things to give to people. Now, the British, at first, regarded this as a form of bribery and felt themselves above it. You should not have to pay Indians to be allies. Allies should fight with you because they saw it was the right thing to do. And they dismissed Indian attitudes on this as mercenary. What they didn't have was an understanding of the role of giving and receiving gifts in Native American society, which is still very prominent and very important today. In the giving a gift, you demonstrate your sincerity, your integrity, that you do not simply speak from the mouth but from the heart. In taking a gift, in receiving that gift, you accept the generosity of that person. You accept that that person is a good person with whom you can have relationships, but you also accept the obligations that go with it. In our society, we know the term Indian giving. You give something because you want something back. Well, that was kind of how it worked. And it was a much more sophisticated and important cultural dimension than many Europeans recognize. The French are no longer in a position to sustain that. They no longer have gifts to give, and their poverty in that sense reinforces in the eyes of the Indians what's happening. They no longer have what it takes to sustain this alliance. They no longer have what it takes to sustain the war effort. And so many Indians, particularly in the Ohio Valley, begin to shift allegiance. They start to mend fences with the British. They make a treaty with the British at the Treaty of Easton in 1758. And basically, they agree not to fight against the British in the Ohio Valley, which opens the way for General John Forbes to do what General Braddock had been unable to do. He's able to advance on the French fort at what is now Pittsburgh and the forks of the Ohio there, and destroy Fort Duquesne. In fact, he doesn't even need to destroy it. The French abandon it and blow it up. That was the key point in North America. That was where the fighting had really started in 1754-55, because both the French and the English regarded the Ohio Valley as the key to the continent. The French saw it as pivotal. It linked their settlements on the St. Lawrence with their embryonic settlements on the Mississippi Valley. It allowed them to continue to expand into the West. The British saw it as key because they saw the French taking it, which meant that the French were encircling the British seaboard colonies and restricting them to the east. Whoever controlled the Ohio Valley and whoever controlled the site of Fort Duquesne, it was believed, held the key to the continent. After 1758, it was untenable to the French because French fortresses in the west did not depend upon bricks and mortar and cannon fire from the fort. They depended upon Indians outside the fort. It was Indian allies who really provided the best defenses for the French. With the Indians gone, they had no defenses, so the French abandoned the Ohio Valley. Now, looking at what takes place there, you could say, well, yeah, Indians are pretty fickle, they're switching sides, you can't rely on them. But again, Indians are operating out of their own interest, and their own interest is not to see the French win or the British win, I think. I think in many ways they really don't care who wins, but they want, at the end of the war, the Ohio Valley in this case, to be empty of Europeans except for traders. Traders are okay, we need them, we can keep them at arm's length, incorporate them into our societies. What we don't want is French or English garrisons. And of course, when the British move in and take over, that's exactly what they get. Now, just so that you know that I'm not making this up. I want to read you some words by Indian people. I often say that these days, if you listen to watch a PBS documentary, you'll see an Indian person speaking with flute music playing in the background. And he or she will be talking about spirituality and living in harmony with Mother Earth, and all that good stuff. If you listen to Indian people talking in treaty councils, or if you read what Indian people speak and write in the 18th century, you don't find that. They are talking about land and freedom and sovereignty. And these are the things that are important. Let me give you I'll read just a few passages here. Because despite their council fire rhetoric of kinship and affection for their British or French fathers and brothers, Indians fought not out of love of the French or the British, but in a consistent effort to keep their country independent of either. To Narasimhan, who was called the Seneca half-king, and the half-king was basically a delegate from the Iroquois Grand Council to the tribes of the Ohio Valley, kind of an intermediary, if you'd like. At the start of the war, he tells the French, "Fathers, both you and the English are white. We, the Indians, live in a country between. Therefore, the land belongs to neither one or the other of you. But the great being above allowed it to be a place of residence for us, the Indians. I'm not afraid to discharge you off this land. The country in between that he refers to, he's actually talking about the Ohio Valley, which is caught, of course, between the French and the British, was Indian land. It's off limits to Europeans, whether they're English or French, except for purposes of trade." And many of the Indian people who were inhabiting the Ohio Valley at this time had already lost their homelands and had moved there. Delawares from Pennsylvania, for instance. They're not about to let it happen again. What they try and do is to hold the balance of power. As one observer described it, to hold the scales and direct the balance between competing French and English power. And they backed the ally that was most likely to help them to secure that. Indians, explained New York's Indian Secretary Peter Wraxall, saw the Anglo-French struggle as, quote, selfish ambition in us both, and feared that whichever nation gains their point will become their masters, not their deliverers. And Dr. Samuel Johnson, safe in England, likened the contest for America to, quote, the quarrel of two robbers for the spoils of a passenger. Each is endeavoring the destruction of the other with the help of the Indians, whose interest is that both should be destroyed. Captain Pierre Pouchot, the French commander at Fort Niagara, said Indians thought it, quote, very strange that others should fight for a country where the author of life has, in their view, created them, where they have always lived, and of which the bones of their ancestors have had possession from the beginning of time. They are unwilling to recognize any foreigner as their master, just as they have none among themselves. Indians wanted, I think, neither European power victorious, if the victors intended to stay. "Why don't you and the French fight in the old country and on the sea?" Delawares asked a Moravian delegate, Christian Frederick Post. "Why do you come to fight on our land? This makes everybody believe you want only to take and settle the land." They believed the English and French had contrived this war and intended to kill all the Indians and then divide the land among themselves. There's an interesting incident. I mentioned Pierre Pouchot there, who was the French commander at Fort Niagara, which was captured by the British in 1759. The British arrived with a contingent of Indian allies, Mohawks and other primarily Indians of the Iroquois Confederacy. Fort Niagara sits in Seneca country, and it exists there through the tolerance and agreement of the Senecas, who at this point are still allies with the French. Well, as you perhaps know, the Six Nations, the Iroquois, the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and then eventually the Tuscaroras, basically stretching across upper New York. Mohawks occupy the eastern part toward the Hudson Valley. the Senecas, the western part toward Niagara Falls. And they are united politically, and they are also united by being members of clans. So if you're a Mohawk of the Bear or Turtle clan, you have relatives who are Senecas of the Bear or Turtle clan. Well, of course, when Mohawks arrive with the British to take Fort Niagara, which is defended by Seneca allies, there's a problem. What the Iroquois don't want to get into is a shooting war among themselves, a civil war. So they kind of go off to one side and smoke and talk about it, and basically agree, well, we'll just sit this one out, shall we? Which they do in Fort Niagara Falls. Indians, I think, are not going to compromise their own interests for the sake of European allies who, in Indian eyes, are a slim reed on which to build at best. Now, when the war ends, France is defeated. At the Peace of Paris in 1763, France essentially pulls out of North America, hands it over to the British, at least east of the Mississippi. Indian people are dumbfounded to hear the terms of the peace treaty because they regard themselves as not defeated, and they ask repeatedly, on what right did the French have to hand over our land, our homelands, to the British? This is where we live, we're in control of this territory, we haven't lost it. Who gets to play this kind of epic board game at the other side of the world and decide that now this territory is British? So immediately, the end of the end of this huge war for the British and the French does not bring peace to Indians. What it brings is alarm. They see the British not pulling out of the Ohio Valley, but building Fort Pitt, what becomes eventually Pittsburgh, which is a much more formidable military fortress than Fort Duquesne ever was. It's one of those six star-shaped kind of things that they kind of represented the best military architecture at the time. They see English red-coated garrisons going into the forts that the French had abandoned, and they see the English building new forts and putting new garrisons on their land. In those circumstances, they look for indicators that the British are going to fulfill the role that the French had in the old days of the alliance. They're going to act as fathers. Now, that term father is one that's used throughout the diplomacy of the time, and it carries on into American Indian policy, where the United States likes to talk about the great white father or the great father in Washington. And when Europeans and Americans use the term, they think of it in terms of patriarchal authority. The Indians are children. The French governor, the English king, the American president are grown-ups, authority figures. But that's not the way it works in Indian society, many of whom are matrilineal. And in matrilineal native societies, the important person is really the mother, because that's from whom you get your clan membership. And the most important male is likely your mother's brother. Your biological father is kind of over there somewhere. A father in these societies is not so much an authority figure, but somebody who accepts the responsibility to protect and to provide for the family. So when the English come into Indian country saying your French father is defeated, say hello to your English father, Indian people look to that father to act as a father should act, which means feeding them, giving them gifts. They too have just come out of a war. They are hungry. They have had devastation in their country. Let's look to the English to do this. And of course that's exactly what the English don't do, because they've just fought the biggest war in their history. Their national debt has skyrocketed. They're broke at the end of this war. And one of the easiest places, it seems, where you can cut back, where you can make retrenchment, is in the Indian department. Who needs Indian allies now that the French are defeated? And General Geoffrey Amherst, who's the British commander-in-chief, despises Indians anyway. To him, they're asking for presents, which include gunpowder for hunting, merely reinforces his view that they are an unreliable mercenary people who will sell their services to the highest bidder. And so the British do not give gifts. In fact, they cut back on gifts. They do not behave toward the Indians as the French had done. To Indian people, this is extremely serious. If these people are not going to give gifts and thereby establish human-to-human relationships in a tangible way and a symbolic way, what does it mean? If they do not want to be friends and allies, they must think that they are our enemies. They must indeed be going to do what we feared that they were going to do and what the French told us all along they were going to do, and that is take our land. And so in 1763, the year that the war ends, a year of peace in Europe and ostensibly in North America, all hell breaks loose in Indian country. When Indians orchestrate a synchronized uprising against the British, it's often called Pontiac's Revolt because of the Odawa war chief who's associated most closely with it, but it was much broader than that. And basically, the Indians destroy every British post west of the Alleghenies except for Fort Pitt, Detroit and Niagara, and those places are under siege. The British eventually are able to win that war, although winning the war may be a little strong. They're actually able to turn back that assault and restore peace, and from that they begin to behave in their relationships more like the French have done and recognize that in Indian country, allies do not dictate policy from a position of power. They negotiate strategy with equals, and they lubricate diplomacy with gifts, and they make sure that Indian people understand that. Indian people in this period are using the term slavery. They said the British intend to reduce us to slavery, which of course should resonate with, in a place like this, that's the same kind of language that's being used a dozen years later. And the way that I look at Pontiac's Revolt, this war of 1763, is that's the first American Revolution. A dozen years before the Americans fight for their independence against Britain, the Indians are doing it for the same reasons: land and freedom and their sovereignty. Now, what does that war that they fought, both the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's Revolt, which really comes hard on the heels of it, what does that mean in Indian country? Well, like most wars in Indian country that are also wars about Indian land, it generates turmoil and chaos. Populations uproot and migrate to get out of the way. Indian peoples from the Ohio Valley, for instance, some of them moved down the Ohio and across the Mississippi into what becomes Spanish territory. That's a movement that many others will follow in years to come. Populations are dislocated. Populations fall. Warriors are off on campaign. They're dying on campaign. It leaves an imbalance at home. There are more women than men. This was not particularly acute in the Ohio Valley, but it was particularly acute in New England, where small communities like Mashpee and the Connecticut communities sided right from the get-go with the British, sent small contingents of men because they were small communities, and suffered devastating losses, which those communities could not sustain. They were left without husbands and fathers. There were widows, there was an imbalance of the population, and the degree of
intermarriage accelerates, so that many Indian women in those communities marry outside. Some of them marry Europeans, but more often they marry African Americans, changing the social fabric of those communities. During the course of the war, lots of white people influx into Indian communities, because one of the things Indians do during a war like this is take captives. And they take captives for a number of reasons. Sometimes they ransom them to the French. Sometimes they ritually torture them to death to appease the spirits of slain relatives. And sometimes, most often, they seem to have adopted them into their own society. Partly this was a response to population decline. It's a way of bolstering population at a time when the demographics are tending downward. And partly it's a cultural thing. Adopting a person into your society was a way of physically replacing someone who had been lost. And in time of war, of course, the losses increase. Taking a captive, bringing that captive home, ritually adopting them, made that person into a Shawnee person, or a Mohawk person, or a Delaware person. I remember talking with an anthropologist once who'd been working in western Alaska, whose daughter was adopted into that community after one of the old elders, an old man, had died. And she said the next day she was walking along the beach with her daughter, and she met an old lady who said, she was sorry she couldn't be at the adoption ritual and ceremony the night before, but that how pleased she was that little Susie, or whoever it was, had been adopted in the place of the old man who died, because she said he always wanted to be able to speak English. The notion that you could actually transform somebody from a European into an Indian, make them a member of that community. So during the war, many of the Indian villages had lots of Europeans in them. During the course of these 7 years of warfare, Indians in the Ohio Valley took hundreds of captives. At the end of the war, the end of Pontiac's War, the British, as the terms of peace, demand they return those captives. And the eyewitnesses recorded what happens. The Shawnees and the Delawares abided by the terms of the treaty, and they brought their captives in to Fort Pitt, and most of them had to be bound. And they were handed over to the English, kicking and screaming, and took every opportunity that they could to escape and go back to the Indians. And Benjamin Franklin writes about that and says, this is kind of troubling, because we're supposed to be the civilized society. What is it in our society that's so repulsive, and what is there in Shawnee and Delaware society that's so attractive that after only a few years, these children particularly, but not just children, cling to them more than to the society of their birth. So there's all kinds of disruption in Native American communities. And the Native American populations are also plummeting because of disease. Now, disease is perhaps the factor in the dispossession and defeat of Native Americans on this continent. In a time of warfare, of course, the conditions under which disease spreads intensify, expand. You've got soldiers marching all over the place. Huge concentrations of population. Some of the armies that gathered during the 7 Years' War are bigger than colonial towns, which, of course, by modern standards, were tiny. You think in terms of these masses of population, the state of medical and sanitary knowledge at the time, and think of these encampments, and think of how disease spreads among the troops. Obviously, when Indians come into contact with that without any developed immunity, or very little developed immunity to the diseases that the Europeans carry, and then they go home into Indian country, diseases spread at a tremendous rate. And of course, in this period, in 1763, there's the question of, did the British infect the Indians with blankets, use germ warfare? General Jeffrey Amherst is reputed to have recommended this, and there's an interesting correspondence between him and Colonel Bouquet, where they're basically saying, wouldn't it be good if we could infect the Indians with smallpox? So the verdict is out on Amherst, but it's not out on the fact that it happened. At Fort Pitt, the officer and trader there actually did give visiting Delawares who came to talk blankets from the smallpox hospital, and there's actually a kind of a chit where they submit an expense account. Ray blankets and handkerchiefs from smallpox hospital to give to visiting Indians. So in this time of conflict, when Indian people need all of their resources to deal with the war, their numbers and their communities are being battered by invisible enemies at the same time. Their economy is disrupted. We tend to use the term Indian warriors as if it's one word, almost synonymous terms. That's what Indians did for a living. And of course, they weren't. They were more like colonial militia. Warfare in Indian society was certainly important. In many ways, it was central to a man's identity and masculinity and getting prowess. But it had its place. And it was regarded not as a natural state of affairs, it was in fact regarded as an abnormal state of affairs. Indian societies circumscribed war with ritual, so that Cherokees, for instance, going off to war, practiced ritual purification, sexual abstinence, dances. They got themselves ready for war, and they thought of it as almost a sacred path. And they prepared for that ritually, psychologically, and in all kinds of ways. Coming back from war, they likewise went through ritual to cleanse themselves of blood, deeds of violence, and thoughts of blood and violence which had no place in Cherokee society, in Cherokee villages. Many European commenters note the fact Indians don't have laws, they don't have police, they don't have jails. Part of it was the understanding that those acts of violence belonged outside. Because outside the village, that's what you did to someone else, to people who were not human beings like the people here. When the colonial wars erupted, and the 7 Years' War in particular, now warfare becomes not something that's done in a particular season for a particular purpose and surrounded by ritual. Now these communities are existing on a war footing. Warriors are going out and coming back all the time. The French and the British are coming into Indian villages, drumming up recruits, giving out guns to chiefs who will recruit warriors. The rituals by which war has been waged are sometimes forgotten, which to the Indians' mind is to court disaster. To go to war without the necessary ritual preparation is to invite suicide. But it's happening more and more. At the same time, a different kind of war is being fought. Europeans and colonial armies fighting Indians tended generally not to seek to defeat them in pitched battle. Often as not, that didn't work out very well, as General Braddock found out, as Arthur St. Clair would find out. The best way to defeat Indians was to march into Indian country, burn their villages, and destroy their cornfields. Because by doing that, you hit them at their home base. By doing that, the women and children had nowhere to shelter and no food to eat, and the warriors were rendered impotent. In the colonial and revolutionary era, the targets were Indian cornfields. And usually the expeditions were in the summer or early fall. Usually August was the best time, because that allowed you to burn the cornfields when the corn was just about ready and destroy it, but it didn't give the Indians time to plant another crop before the winter came. And this was the tactic used very effectively during the American Revolution, when George Washington dispatched General Sullivan into Iroquois country with orders basically to lay waste Iroquois, and Sullivan destroyed 40 Iroquois towns and burnt millions of bushels of corn. So this is a different kind of warfare. It's being brought right into Indian country, and of course it causes economic disruption. Now those warriors who are now not going on campaign at a particular season, but are turning out to fight for the French or the British to go on extended campaigns, ask their allies in return, okay, look after our women and children, feed them, make sure they have blankets while we're away. Their own economy is disrupted. Hunting is disrupted by the warfare. The corn economy is often in ruins because of invading armies. And so the Indians are becoming increasingly dependent upon their allies, upon the Europeans. That leaves them in a desperate situation when, first of all, the French are no longer able to supply them, and then the British refuse to supply them. Looked at that way, Pontiac's warriors were not going to war because they were against the British because they were bloodthirsty savages. They were going to war because they had no choice. They were painted into a corner. And under normal circumstances, the chiefs might have counseled moderation and talked them out of it. Native American societies, Eastern Woodland societies, basically had two classes of chiefs. Civil chiefs, who were the older guys, who'd been warriors in their time, but had developed a reputation for good sense and wisdom and moderate counsel. They were the people who presided, if that's the right word, in the villages, mediated disputes, got people to work things out, and gave good counsel. Warrior chiefs were younger guys, crazy guys, guys whose war medicine was strong, guys who were out to make a name for themselves on the war trail, so that in later life they could move up through the ranks and become esteemed civil chiefs, having demonstrated as young men that they were protectors of their people and strong warriors and men of courage and prowess. But those people did not have any authority or influence in the village. When the war party left the village, going back to that Cherokee example, the Cherokee civil chiefs handed over temporary authority to the war chief. And the war chief led, usually by example rather than by command, the war chief led for the duration of the war party, and when it came back, they ritually handed back that authority to the civil chiefs. That was a system that had worked for a very, very long time, and it all went to hell during this period, because now the British and the French were beating on the doors, trying to get Indian warriors to sign up, to join them on campaign. They could not always wait and would not always have the patience to observe these rituals. And so what they would sometimes do is not go to the civil chiefs and say, let us have your young men. They would go direct to the war chiefs, and they would give them gifts and guns and say, give these things to your young men. And so the war chiefs now kind of circumvent the civil chiefs. They have now co-opted one of the key responsibilities of an Indian leader, which was to redistribute wealth, to make sure that those who have not have, and it was a responsibility of a chief to distribute what was available to his people. Now the war chiefs have the ability, fueled by European allies, to give the young men guns and metal weapons and the things that they need, if in return they come out on campaign for them as a client chief of the British or the French. Increasingly what's happening is that the predominant influence in Indian communities is being now exerted by the younger war chiefs, and the elder civil chiefs are kind of left out of the loop. And time again, Indian older chiefs say that to the British or the French. We can no longer control our young men. It is the warriors now who are calling the shots, who are making these decisions. And I think when I made the comment about the stereotype of Indians being warriors and Indians being a warrior society, I don't know that's not true in traditional times, but I think it becomes true in the 18th century as a result of this warfare, which disrupts the ceremonial cycles and disrupts the political systems and the social structures Indian peoples. What is the end of the French and Indian War for the British and for the French is really not the end of any war at all for Indian people, because the issue for which they were fighting in this war, land, freedom and sovereignty, is still the thing that becomes targeted. They continue to have to fight for it. All that happens is that the people who are trying to get their hands on it change. Maybe it was the French, well now it's the British. Well, what happens in 1763? The British win this great war and they almost lose it in North America in Pontiac's revolt. They respond in October of 1763 by issuing the Royal Proclamation, which says we've got to get a handle on this because otherwise the frontier is going to be ablaze forever. As long as white people and colonists are left free to intrude on Indian lands, there will be these kinds of wars. And so the British run a line, an imaginary line, down the Appalachian Mountains and say, east of this is British. West of this is British territory, but it's Indian country. It's reserved to Indians. And it's off limits to British subjects. We can still buy that land when we see fit, but the purchases of Indian lands will be conducted by the duly appointed agents of the Crown, meeting in open and full council with the Indian nations. In this way, the British hoped to avoid repetitions of Pontiac's war and bring peace and harmony to the frontier. Well, what made sense in London, of course, infuriated people in North America. George Washington had been out in the Ohio Valley in 1753-54. In fact, he really caused the war, if you're getting down to the spark that ignited the World War. One of the things he'd also been doing out there is casting a coveter's eye on the rich, fertile lands that he saw. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and a bunch of other household names who become famous as patriots and revolutionary leaders are up to their necks in speculating in Western lands. The Royal Proclamation really doesn't discourage settlers because the British don't have the troops or even the will to keep settlers from squatting on Indian land. Settlers kind of ignore it. Daniel Boone doesn't pay much attention to it. The people it really affects are not the settlers, but the speculators, the land companies, the people who hope to buy up huge amounts of this land, or rather get this land granted to them by the Crown and then turn around and sell it. Because the Royal Proclamation casts a cloud over any title and really puts a dint in their activities. It's really, in many ways, the first step in alienating those people who just finished fighting a war for the British Empire and thought of themselves as British subjects. And they felt that in 1763, the French and Indian menace had finally been removed. It was now open season on Indian land, and the British slam the door shut and say, that's Indian land, and you cannot go there. This becomes seen as an act of tyranny by the British government, and it's the first real step in pushing men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson into that anti-British position, which, of course, a dozen years later results in the American Revolution. And when the American Revolution breaks out, Indian people in the Ohio Valley and elsewhere at first try to remain neutral. That's an impossibility for them. They try to remain neutral. They say to the British and the Americans who are sending their agents into Indian country, this is a war between you. You should fight it out. We really don't understand what you're fighting about. But this we do understand, that this war that you say is a war about independence and freedom and liberty is also a war about Indian land. And so for Indian people, the stakes remain the same. And for Indian people, the objectives and the criteria in the American Revolution are exactly the same as they were in the French and Indian War. What path do we take to do what's needed to preserve Indian lands, Indian homelands, Indian freedoms, and Indian sovereignty? And of course, what happens in 1783 at the Peace of Paris, 20 years after the French have sold the Indians down the river at that Peace of Paris, the British do the same things and hand over everything from the west of the Appalachians, south of the Great Lakes, north of Florida, hand it over to the United States. And so this is now American territory. The United States in 1783 is in exactly the same position as Britain in 1763 had been, dead broke, has nothing in its treasury. The only national resource it has is what it calls public lands, with which it's been paying its veterans and with which it can sell, it can generate hopefully some income to fill the national treasury. And of course those public lands are Indian lands. And from 1783 it's a straight shot for Indian people in the Ohio Valley, because now they are fighting again to protect their lands, which the United States say belong to them by right of conquest, because the British have given them, and Indian people say, we've not been defeated, we've never given our lands to anybody. So when you're looking at the French and Indian War, it really is a pivotal event. And as a teacher of Indian history, I often tell my students that, don't believe those books that you read that read as if there were no Indians in American history. Because not only is it ridiculous, but even the way that the sort of standard narrative unfolds doesn't make any sense without Indians. For instance, the United States would not have been created in the way it was without, of course, the American Revolution. The American Revolution would not have happened, certainly when and how it did, had it not been for the French and Indian War. Thank you.